Some prisoners noticed something strange on their first morning in the American camp, because men were lining up not for food and not for roll call, but for a small wooden building that released clouds of steam. And when the first German POW stepped inside and heard water rushing from above like rain indoors, he hesitated, wondering why anyone would stand beneath it on purpose. The first time the German prisoners were guided toward the bathhouse, many of them assumed it would be another inspection room or a delousing station like the ones they had known during earlier transfers across Europe, because in their experience water was usually associated with medical control, disease prevention, or strict schedules rather than comfort. Yet the American guards simply pointed toward a low wooden structure near the edge of the camp and explained through gestures and limited translation that the men could wash themselves there whenever their assigned group was called, which created a quiet confusion among prisoners who had grown used to washing from metal basins, rivers, or carefully rationed buckets where every liter had to be justified. As they approached the building, the air changed slightly because warm moisture drifted through the open doorway, and several prisoners slowed their steps while trying to understand how so much heated water could be available in a place designed to hold hundreds of captives, since in wartime Europe, entire towns sometimes struggled to maintain regular bathing facilities. And fuel shortages often meant that hot water was considered a rare luxury reserved for hospitals or special circumstances, not for ordinary soldiers, and certainly not for prisoners of war. Inside, the room was simple but surprising, with wooden slats on the floor, rows of metal pipes along the walls, and shower heads fixed above at regular intervals, while a faint echo of running water filled the space in a steady rhythm that sounded almost unnatural to men who associated indoor water with careful pouring rather than constant flow. And one interpreter explained that each group would have several minutes to wash under the streams, using soap that was distributed in small portions, after which the next group would enter, a system that emphasized routine and hygiene rather than privilege. Some prisoners watched the first volunteers step forward, noticing how they reached upward to test the water as if expecting it to stop suddenly. Yet the flow continued without interruption, creating an unfamiliar sense of abundance that contrasted sharply with memories of field conditions where mud, sweat, and cold cloth wipes had often replaced proper bathing for weeks at a time. And this contrast quietly reshaped their perception of captivity in America, because the environment did not match the harsher expectations they had carried across the ocean. The guards did not rush the process, and their calm behavior added another layer of uncertainty, since the prisoners had been trained to anticipate strict control around any facility involving water or sanitation. But here the procedure felt procedural rather than punitive, and that difference was difficult to interpret for men whose recent years have been defined by scarcity, urgency, and suspicion. Several prisoners later admitted in letters and recollections that the simple act of standing beneath a steady stream of warm water produced a strange emotional response, not because it was luxurious in a civilian sense, but because it represented stability and predictability, two things that had nearly vanished from their lives during the later years of the war. And while none of them forgot their status as captives, moments like these complicated the clear lines they had once imagined between enemy and caretaker. Even so, not everyone relaxed immediately, because some worried that comfort might come with hidden expectations or future restrictions. And this cautious mindset reflected the psychological habits formed during years of conflict, where sudden generosity could sometimes precede new rules. Yet as days passed, and the bathing schedule remained consistent, the men slowly accepted that regular hygiene was simply part of camp management in the United States, designed to maintain health and order, rather than to send a political message. By the end of those first visits, the bathhouse had become another routine location within the camp, yet its memory stayed vivid for many prisoners, since it symbolized the moment when their assumptions about captivity in America began to shift from fear of deprivation toward a more complex reality shaped by logistics, resources, and adherence to international conventions. A realization that did not erase homesickness or uncertainty, but did alter the texture of daily life in subtle and lasting ways. In the days that followed, the bathhouse visits became part of the camp schedule. Yet the novelty did not disappear quickly because many prisoners continued to observe the details with quiet attention, trying to understand how the system functioned and what it revealed about the country holding them. Since the availability of heated water required fuel, plumbing, maintenance, and organization, all of which suggested a level of infrastructure that contrasted sharply with the wartime shortages they had left behind in Europe, where rail lines were damaged, cities were bombed, and basic utilities often failed without warning. Some of the older soldiers compared the experience to pre-war civilian facilities they had known years earlier, recalling public bathhouses in German towns, where people washed on fixed days. Yet even those memories did not fully match the steady reliability of the camp showers, because here the water pressure remained consistent and the temperature rarely fluctuated, which created a sense that the system was designed for long-term operation rather than temporary improvisation, a detail that subtly reminded the prisoners that their captivity might last longer than they first hoped. Conversations among the men often returned to practical questions, such as how the water was heated, whether boilers operated nearby, and how fuel was supplied despite wartime rationing. And these discussions were not driven by comfort alone, but by a soldier's instinct to analyze logistics, since understanding supply chains had been part of military thinking. And the camp itself functioned like a small self-contained world where food, water, medical care, and sanitation followed organized patterns that could be studied and predicted. A few prisoners who were assigned to work details near maintenance areas occasionally noticed pipes running underground or storage tanks positioned behind fence sections. And while they did not receive technical explanations, the visible components confirmed that the system relied on planning rather than improvisation, which gradually reduced suspicion and replaced it with a pragmatic acceptance that hygiene was treated as a necessary standard within the camp, aligned with international rules. Regarding prisoner welfare, the psychological effect of regular bathing also became noticeable, because men who could wash consistently tended to maintain their uniforms better, care for minor skin irritations before they worsened, and preserve a sense of personal dignity that war often eroded. And this did not transform captivity into comfort, but it reduced certain hardships that had once been considered unavoidable, creating a daily rhythm where cleanliness marked the passage of time in an otherwise restricted environment. Letters written by some POWs mention the showers indirectly, often describing them as part of routine life without dramatic language, which in itself is revealing, because it shows how quickly extraordinary circumstances can become normalized when repeated. And for families reading those letters years later, such details offered glimpses into the structured nature of POW camps in the United States, where order and health regulations shaped many aspects of daily existence. Still, there were moments of quiet reflection when prisoners stood beneath the falling water and thought about home, because the sensation of warmth and the sound of steady flow could trigger memories of civilian life before the war. And these private reflections carried emotional weight, even if they were never spoken aloud, since captivity separated men not only from their countries, but from the routines that once defined ordinary living. By this stage, the bathhouse no longer represented surprise. Yet it remained a symbol of how different their situation was from what they had imagined during capture. And this difference continued to influence their perception of American camps, where discipline and structure existed alongside provisions that, while basic by American standards, felt unexpectedly stable to men shaped by years of uncertainty, scarcity, and constant movement across a war-torn continent. As the weeks turned into months, the bathhouse routine began to reveal something deeper about camp life, because it showed how captivity was managed not only through fences and guards, but through schedules, systems, and small structures that shaped behavior. And the prisoners gradually realized that predictability itself was a form of control, since when every group knew its assigned time to eat, to work, and even to wash, the days became measurable and orderly, reducing chaos but also reminding them how little freedom they truly possessed. The men often noticed how the guards treated the bath schedule with the same seriousness as roll calls, ensuring that numbers matched and that no group stayed longer than allowed, which indicated that hygiene was considered part of regulation rather than a privilege. And this consistency sent a quiet message that the camp followed established standards, something many POWs had heard about in briefings regarding international conventions, but had not fully expected to experience personally. For some prisoners, the showers became one of the few places where the noise of the barracks faded, because the sound of water masked conversations and created brief moments of privacy in a crowded environment. And although guards remained nearby, the atmosphere felt less tense, allowing men to think quietly, reflect on their situation, or simply enjoy a rare sense of physical relief after long work details under the sun or in the dust. There were also practical benefits that slowly became clear, since regular washing reduced the spread of lice and skin infections, problems that had troubled many armies during the war, and medical staff within the camp encouraged cleanliness not as comfort, but as prevention, reinforcing the idea that a healthy prisoner population was easier to manage than a sick one, which again tied personal care to the broader system of control and order. Occasionally, newly arrived prisoners reacted with the same suspicion earlier groups had shown, testing the water cautiously or asking others if it was truly safe, and the veterans of the camp would answer calmly, explaining the routine, the temperature controls, and the unchanging schedule. And in doing so, they passed down informal knowledge that helped newcomers adjust faster, turning shared experience into a quiet form of community inside confinement. Some men even began timing their visits carefully, preferring certain hours when the water felt warmer or the room less crowded. And these small preferences gave them a limited sense of choice, which mattered psychologically, because captivity often stripped away decision-making, and even minor control over routine could help maintain morale. Through all of this, the bathhouse stood as a reminder that captivity in America followed a different pattern than the brutal images many had feared, not gentle or free, but structured and regulated. And this distinction shaped how prisoners interpreted their situation, balancing realism with cautious acknowledgement that their treatment, at least in this aspect, followed rules that aimed to maintain basic human standards amid the wider destruction of the war. As the routine continued across changing seasons, the bathhouse gradually took on a meaning that went beyond simple hygiene, because it became one of the fixed points in a life otherwise defined by limits. And when people live in confinement, fixed points help the mind organize time, since knowing that certain things happen on certain days creates markers that divide long stretches into manageable segments. And many prisoners quietly relied on these segments to keep track of passing weeks, without needing calendars, which were not always available or up to date. They also noticed that the bath schedule adjusted slightly with weather, because colder months sometimes brought warmer water and more careful timing to prevent men from returning to the barracks chilled. And this attention to seasonal conditions suggested that camp management planned ahead rather than reacting at the last moment, which again contrasted with the unpredictable disruptions the prisoners had known during wartime movements across Europe, where facilities were often temporary and supplies uncertain. Some prisoners paid attention to how repairs were handled, seeing maintenance workers check pipes, valves, and heaters. And although these tasks seemed ordinary, they demonstrated that the system was expected to function long-term, since no one invests effort in maintaining equipment meant to be used only briefly. And this quiet signal reinforced the understanding that the camp operated as a stable installation rather than a provisional holding site. At a social level, the bathhouse also created informal routines among the men, because groups often entered together with those from the same barracks. And these shared moments allowed for short conversations away from crowded sleeping areas, though topics usually remained neutral and practical, since prisoners were careful about what they discussed in semi-public spaces. Yet, even neutral talk helped maintain a sense of normal interaction. The guard's presence remained steady, but not intrusive, positioned to supervise without interfering in the process. And this style of oversight reflected a system focused on order rather than intimidation, which many prisoners recognized as different from harsher environments they had feared before arrival, though they never forgot that supervision existed at all times. Over time, the act of showering required little thought, turning into a habit like lining up for meals or attending roll call. And when something becomes habit, it stops drawing emotional reaction and instead becomes part of the background structure that supports daily life. And background structures often influence morale more quietly than dramatic events do. For some prisoners, the showers also reinforced personal discipline, because maintaining cleanliness helped them preserve a sense of identity separate from their status as captives, and small acts of self-care can carry psychological importance in environments where individuality feels reduced. By this stage, the bathhouse no longer symbolized surprise or contrast, but simple routine. Yet its steady operation continued to illustrate how the camp functioned through logistics, planning, and adherence to regulations, showing that even within the constraints of war, systems existed to manage daily human needs in organized ways, and for men observing closely. These systems revealed as much about their surroundings as any official information ever could. As their time in the camp stretched on and the early uncertainty of capture faded into a long routine, the bathhouse became one of those places the prisoners no longer questioned, yet quietly relied upon. Because when people live for months within the same boundaries, they begin to measure stability through repeated access to basic needs and the steady availability of water, heat, and soap signaled that certain systems around them were designed to function continuously rather than temporarily, which mattered to men who had seen how quickly order could collapse when infrastructure failed in wartime Europe. They understood by now that providing regular showers was not an act of generosity, but a matter of management, since crowded living conditions could lead to illness if hygiene declined, and illness inside a camp created complications for both prisoners and administrators. So cleanliness served a practical purpose tied to health regulations and efficiency. And recognizing this helped the prisoners interpret their situation with realism rather than emotion, seeing the bathhouse as part of an organized framework rather than a comfort offered out of sympathy. Some prisoners reflected on how different armies approached sanitation, recalling periods earlier in the war when entire units relied on rivers, rainwater, or infrequent wash stations, and comparing those memories to the fixed plumbing of the American camp highlighted how resources and geography influence daily life. Because a country with secure infrastructure can maintain routines that become difficult or impossible in active combat zones, and this comparison quietly broadened their understanding of how the same war could look very different depending on location. There were also small, personal routines that formed around these visits, with some men preferring to wash quickly and return to the barracks, while others took the full allotted time to stand under the water and enjoy a brief sense of physical relief after labor. And these differences showed how individuals adapt in their own ways even when schedules are fixed, since personal habits develop wherever small choices are possible. The bathhouse also remained one of the few places where visible signs of the outside environment appeared indirectly, because changes in water temperature or scheduling sometimes reflected fuel availability or weather conditions, and attentive prisoners learned to read these signs as indicators of seasonal change beyond the fences, helping them stay oriented in time when news from the outside world was limited. Guards and maintenance staff continued their routine work without drawing attention to it, and this quiet consistency reinforced the idea that the system aimed for order above all else, since orderly environments reduce conflict and keep large populations manageable. And many prisoners recognized that predictability, while restrictive, was easier to endure than constant uncertainty. By the later stages of their captivity, most men no longer thought of the showers as unusual. Yet when they compared notes with newly arrived prisoners who reacted with surprise, they were reminded of their own first impressions. And this contrast showed how quickly unfamiliar conditions can become normal through repetition, a process that helps people adjust to long-term confinement. In this way, the bathhouse stood as a small but telling part of camp life, illustrating how sanitation, logistics, and regulation shaped the daily experience of prisoners. And for those who paid attention, it revealed that captivity was managed through systems as much as through security, with ordinary routines quietly defining the texture of their days as the war continued beyond the fences. In the end, the showers did not change the reality of captivity, did not shorten the war, and did not remove the fences around them. Yet they remained one of those quiet details where expectation met a different reality, because many of the prisoners had associated wartime with irregular washing, cold water, and improvised conditions, and encountering a steady bathing system inside a POW camp challenged those assumptions, showing that daily life in another country could follow different standards even during the same global conflict. What began as hesitation slowly turned into practical understanding, as repeated visits showed that the bathhouse existed for hygiene, health, and order rather than comfort. And this shift from suspicion to acceptance illustrates how people adapt by observing patterns and forming logical explanations, since logical explanations help maintain mental balance in unfamiliar environments. For the prisoners, the lesson was not about enjoying warm water, but about recognizing that ordinary routines often reflect infrastructure, resources, and regulations more than intention. And seeing this firsthand gave them a clearer, more grounded view of the system around them, built from daily experience rather than rumor. Over time, the bathhouse blended into the background of camp life, yet the memory of their first surprise sometimes remained, because first encounters with difference tend to stay in memory, especially when they involve basic human needs like cleanliness and health. Many physical traces of POW camps faded after the war, but memories of daily routines lasted longer. And small moments like these helped former prisoners describe captivity not only through guards and fences, but through ordinary structures that revealed how life was organized. And so the story of the camp showers settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement, people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through quiet daily details as much as through major events, with a simple stream of water quietly illustrating how different systems shaped life during a time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.